In this part of our tutorial, we're going to add if statements to a for loop. So we're going to have our for loop run, and there'll be an if statement within the curly braces. So this will be introducing some kind of control flow by testing a condition. So our example is going to be looking at a bank transaction, so it's going to be an array of doubles, and we're going to go through the array and each time test if that particular element is less than 0. If it is, then we want to add them together because we want to keep track of our spending. So up until this point, we've basically been having our loops doing exactly the same thing with each iteration. So we've seen them access elements in an array and maybe print them out or add to them or even just add to a count, like a number like count. Now we're going to introduce some control flow within a for loop by putting in an if statement. So what this will do is it will allow us to perform different operations depending on the values we come across. So let's say we have a bank account. Look at that example again. It's full of doubles which basically represent the transactions for the month. So let's create a double array, and this is going to be called transaction history. And it's basically just going to contain a history of all of our transactions. So the positive transactions will be deposits and negative transactions will be withdrawals. So let's say we have a $1,000 deposit at the beginning, then a $500, then a withdrawal of $32.65, then another withdrawal of, let's say, $76.58, and then we have another deposit of $500, and then a big purchase of $367.99. Okay, so think of this as being kind of like a bank statement. So when you go to look at your bank statement, it has all of your history in a list. So it has the deposits on one side and withdrawals on the next. And what we want to know is how much money we've been spending this month. So what we'll be doing is we'll be iterating through each element of this loop, and when we come across the negative ones, we're just going to add them all together. So why don't we create a variable to store that number in. This will be a double and we'll call it spending. We're going to initialize it to have the value 0.0. Not that it really matters whether we include the decimal or not. Okay, so let's create our loop. We'll set it up and then I'll explain exactly what we're going to do with the if statement. So we want to start at 0. We want to run until the length. So this is going to be the transaction history.length. And we are going to index by 1 each time. Okay, this will ensure that we start at the beginning, we run until the end, and we're just indexing by 1 each time, so we'll start here and access every single element. So this is pretty standard if you want to access every element. You start at 0, run till the end of the array, and then just index by 1 each time. Okay, now let's form the body of the for loop. So we only want the negative transactions, and I think a good way to do this would be to test each element and to see if it's less than 0. So what we can do is we can say set up our if statement. We've seen these before. And so basically we're just going to test this condition. So if the transaction history at the current index is less than 0, then we want to add it to spending. So spending equals spending plus transaction history of 0. Transaction history of I. So now what this will do is going through each element of our array, it's going to test each time if that element is less than 0. If it is, we're going to add them all together and store it in this variable called spending. And if it's not, we're not going to do anything because we only want to keep track of spending. And at the very end of this loop, once it exits, let's just have it print out. So we'll have text.text because we're in Android, and we're going to have that equals spending and then toString. Okay, so then again at the very end of our for loop, we're just going to print out the total figure, which will be the total amount of spending that we've done. Okay, let's see this in action. So we'll run with the Nexus S. Unexpected symbol, end of file. Not quite sure what's going on there. Let's try running it again. I see we don't have enough curly braces. There we go. Very cool. So just to, oh, there we go. Let's get rid of that. Alright, and now we get this nice number. Well, I mean, it's not nice because that means we spend that much money, but that's exactly what we want because we're going through each time. So we'll go through the first element and say, no, it's not less than 0. Second, not less than 0. Third is, so we'll add that. The fourth is, we'll add that. Fifth isn't, and the sixth is, so we'll add that. So now this allows us to, instead of printing out every element, it's just going to print out the ones that we want, or rather we're just going to access and do something with the elements that we want. So this is really just one way that you can introduce control flow into your for loop. So it's not doing the same thing to every element like we've seen before. This is kind of picking and choosing the ones that we want based on whether or not they are less than 0. So again, great way to introduce control flow into your for loops and to test every element rather than going through each element and writing 1,000 different if statements. In this part of our tutorial, we added if statements to a for loop. So we had the example of an array of bank transactions, which were all doubles, and we added together only the negative elements of this array of doubles. So within our for loop, we accessed one element at a time and tested it to see if it was less than 0. If it was, we added it to a variable called spending and then returned that at the end. So by now you should be able to write for loops with conditions in them and be able to do different things to different parts of the array.